as much as I hate to do this, I think I need to refactor large portions of this logic to fix the underlying issue of not appropriately accounting for empty columns. So I think I do need to re-add a column checker class. What I'm going to do is put them here, 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 and so on, so that when the timer bar overlaps with them, the column checker is going to, we're going to remove the onus of checking for individual blocks from the timer bar and instead just overlap the grid. So we'll overlap the grid, which will reset our position, and we'll overlap the column checker objects, which will run this part of the logic of, you know, turning blocks into matched blocks, or sorry, turning matched blocks into highlighted blocks. That's going to happen like in the same function here. So instead of checking for highlighted blocks and marking them for deletion, or, you know, checking the blocks above them for highlight, we're going to do the same thing here, but we're going to check for matched blocks, turn them highlighted, and then do the same logic. But we're going to have this function scan all the blocks at once in a column instead of overlapping. So right now the timer bar is, you know, overlapping all the blocks, and then when it leaves that column here, it's going to check the blocks above it for, check all the blocks that it just passed through. So it's basically, you know, wasting time by overlapping with each block, and then when it leaves the column, having a separate function check each block again. So instead we're going to consolidate some of this logic and just restructure it in a way where we can deal with the empty columns. Because right now, if the player does something like this, these blocks should have been cleared as soon as the timer bar got here, but because we're not accounting for the empty columns, it's all gone wrong until the timer bar touches a column with a non-empty column, then they clear. But that's not a good way of going about it, so we need to correct a lot of this. So I will be recreating a column checker BP function in class, but I'm going to spawn them in when I spawn in the grid. So it's going to have a block collision or box collision. It's going to be relatively small, possibly even smaller than that, because I don't want it to collide with the blocks, but I don't want it to be so small that the timer bar could pass through it in a long tick. That would be bad. So now I need to go to where I'm spawning in the grid objects, and when I spawn in a column, I'm also going to spawn in the column checkers, because they're going to be at the same horizontal offset and a different vertical offset. So to spawn in these column checker classes, I'm going to use the same logic that I used here for spawning in the column cubes, but I'm not going to do it here because I don't want to spawn in whole new actors in the construction script of a different actor. It's an unsafe operation to do that, so I'm going to just copy a lot of this. We don't need the vertical offset because these are going to have a 0 vertical offset. I'm not going to spawn in a static mesh either, but for now I'll just copy this. So I'm going to take this to begin play, and I'll just call it spawn in. I'll do a collapse graph at the end. So we want to go at the same horizontal offsets as the column cubes, but we don't want to add a static mesh component. We want to spawn actor from class. And we're going to do the column checker class. Now we don't actually need one of these at the final column like we did with the column cubes, so I will do a subtract 1 here so that I don't put 1 at the rightmost column cube, because they check the column in front of them to the right of them, so there's no column to the right there. And this is not a relative transform, this is the world location. So we do need to do these relative to the grid, so get actor location. Y and Z are going to be whatever the root, this element is here. And then we just add the offset from the current iteration of the loop. And this should spawn in the column checkers at the desired location, which is along the bottom here. So, right on top of this guy, and then right here, and right here, and right here. Let's go ahead and see what happens if I do that. If I now look at the column checkers, they should be, if I eject first, they should hopefully be at the proper spots here. Yeah, exactly where we want them to be. And the last one, it's just going to go on for, I'm doing it twice. The pesky editor test grid is spawning its own set of them. So again, we'll just say go away for now. They'll still be there here, but we'll only have one set actually be at this elevation, so that's fine. Turns out it's the second set of checkers here. That's fine though. So when the timer bar passes along overlaps the, we have to make sure these have the proper settings too. When we spawn in the column checkers, we want to make sure that they have the right collision settings. We can do that by just going to the actual object here and setting their collision properties. Overlap all dynamic, that should be fine. They're of type world dynamic, so they should create events when the timer bar overlaps with them. So now this is going to be a pretty big overhaul to the timer bar layout, but we don't want to check for block BP in here. The scan column for blocks function will do everything related to blocks that the timer bar needs to do, all this stuff. So we're going to go ahead and collapse this stuff to a function. That way we can more easily move things around without getting confused. So we want to section off the functionality here where we take in a block object and we see if it's part of the quad, and if it's not, we tell it to become highlighted and we add it to our highlighted array. If it is a matched block, it becomes highlighted. Collapse it to a function and call it make matched block highlighted. That's not an entirely accurate way to describe what this function does, because it takes in a block whether it's matched or not, and if it is matched it becomes highlighted, and if it's not matched it does nothing, but close enough I think. And we can elucidate that in the description. Takes in a reference to a block BP. If this block is not part of the player's quad and is matched, then the block will be made highlighted and added to the highlighted array. Else nothing happens. So instead of casting here, and instead of taking in just some random object, we're going to take in specifically a block BP reference. And it's up to the caller to ensure that it's of type block BP. So we still need to cast this object. And if the cast is successful, pass it into this function. And I don't think we're going to need this boolean anymore, because I was using that to make sure we didn't, call this function on the same block several times, or so that when we exit, we don't call this logic multiple times. We want to make sure that this function is only called once here. But we're going to have it only be called once because this logic is going to happen when we pass over a column checker object. So we can remove this and only do the check for the grid type. We obviously need to remember to call this somewhere, but for now I'm just going to delete this whole thing, really clean up the timer bar's top level graph because it's getting a bit ridiculous. It doesn't seem ridiculous just to have like what we had here, but it can get confusing. You come back and you forget why you had things laid out that way without comments and without breaking things up into functions. It's easy to forget why you had it that way. So all we're checking when we overlap right now is it part of the grid? And if it is, then do this. If it's not, then we're going to check and see, is it a column checker? Or we could even leave the whole column checker check on the column checker objects themselves to clear that up. But yeah, we could do that. But I think I'll do it in here, just for in case we later move this object and implement it in a different way. We're gonna do it here. So we'll say branch again. If the other actor is of class, and then if this class is equal to column checker, then we're going to scan column for blocks. And we don't need a end collision overlap because that was only checking for the blocks. And we're going to refactor this logic and do it in a different way. So we're going to scan column for blocks, and the location is going to be this actor's location, which is the column checker, plus 1/2 of a horizontal offset so that it gets at the center of the actual column. So we're going to split this vector, get the game mode reference, get horizontal offset, divide it by 2 so that we get half of the offset. Plug that into the x and then leave y and z 0. And this is where we're going to start our scan, just like before where we started it, you know, at the bottom of the grid, at the location of the center of that column. It's the same thing, just getting it in a different way. And we can basically remove this entire thing now, I think, but I'm going to just unhook it so it doesn't do anything, and then I'm going to leave it for now. But we need to change what scan column for blocks does so that it does this make matched block highlighted thing. So it's going to again scan the entire column for all blocks except the quad, and it's going to find the bottommost one first. If it's a block, we're going to need to expand this logic here. If it's a block, then we need to check and see if it's matched. If it is a matched block, we tell it to become highlighted. So we can just actually run this function, because it's going to make sure it's not part of quad, which is redundant for now, but we'll leave it in. And if it's matched, it's going to tell it to become highlighted rather, and add it to the array. So we can just add this entire block of this function. If it's a valid block, then I'm going to move this whole thing out. Then we run this function, which just, if it's matched, then it becomes highlighted. And if it was highlighted after this function ran, then we do the same logic we already did. So that could be okay. Now we can remove, well, it's already not executing anymore, so we'll leave that just for now. Let's go ahead and see what I'm forgetting, because I'm sure something is going to go wrong. It's checking every column. It's not messing with unmatched blocks. Let's see if those matched blocks become highlighted. They do, and they get cleared. So that's good. So far so good. Let's see those. Okay, now those don't run their check again, but we can fix that. So far I'm liking this solution a lot more. It seems a little bit cleaner, and it's obviously working where the other one wasn't working, so that's good. There are errors, of course. Let's see what we're doing wrong here. So we're getting a null reference when we try to access the timer bar from the DropAll blocks to fill gaps function. So if we go here, yeah, so this timer bar reference is null when we try to access it, which means it's probably happening like very early. Let's see what happens if I clear the log, press play. Immediately that appears 4 times. But it only happens 4 times, and so something's happening where DropAll blocks to fill gaps is getting called immediately, which we don't want. It's the 0th, I think it's like, you know, the column checker that's at the bottom left corner. Is running, the timer bar is overlapping that. It's going to run scan column for blocks, and it's going to be empty, so this is going to return false, and it's going to drop all blocks to fill gaps here, even though there's no there couldn't possibly be a match yet. So I think what we can do is turn off collision initially on the column checkers, and then turn it on after like a second. So a bit weird, but in begin play I'm going to set collision. Is that a possibility? Set collision enabled in the box, and we'll say, you know, I think it's query only right now, but let's check. Right now it's query only, overlap all dynamic, so I can probably turn off generate overlap events, right? So what I'm going to do is do a timer from the creation of the collision checker. Set timer by function name and just say, enable overlap events. We can just do half a second because the player's not going to form a match in half a second on the bottom left side. Probably. Let's do 0.2 seconds just to be, safe. That should still be plenty of time for the initialization. And instead of doing that, I'm going to just do a custom event called enable overlap events to set this to true. And then we have to make sure it's initially false by default. And now let's see what happens if we clear the log and press play. We don't get that error anymore. And that error wasn't creating any catastrophic effects on the gameplay. It was just a null reference exception thing that in blueprints, luckily, Unreal can survive those, but it's not good to have them anyway. So that's good. I'll just put a little comment here, say prevent race conditions in the initial overlap of the timer bar and the bottom left column checker where game mode tries to access timer bar before initialization is complete. I probably misspelled that because I couldn't see. Access timer bar before initialization is complete. So I mean that's why I did this. So now we can remove all of this logic. I'm pretty sure we don't need it anymore. And that means we can get rid of check for matched blocks, the Boolean, because we were using that in our previous implementation of the solution, which we don't need anymore. So I just delete that variable. And now when the blocks drop down and they complete their fall, well, when all of them have completed falling all the way, so here, right after we clear the blocks array, we can, or actually before we clear the blocks array, so we can do this properly, we need to do a for each loop again and have each block in the blocks array update its match status. Actually, it needs to be every single block, not just the ones in the blocks array, but all valid blocks that are not highlighted, because this just accounts for the ones that are actually falling, but they could fall into blocks that are placed at the bottom already, but they form new matches, so all of them need to update the matches, their matched status. So we can just call check for matches on all blocks, and that should work fine in this scenario too. So before we clear blocks array, I guess it doesn't matter if we do it before or after we clear blocks array, but we'll go ahead and do it before. So after the for each loop for dropping them all, then we just say check for matches on all blocks. We may want to only check for ones that are not highlighted, but at this point, the ones that have the highlighted type should be marked for deletion, so they're about to be destroyed, or they're already in the process of being destroyed. So this function will make sure they're valid and not pending kill. So this should ignore all of the highlighted ones that are getting destroyed as this is happening, or immediately after this happens, they'll be destroyed, and this won't even acknowledge them, I think. So that should be fine. So now that should correct the... Oh, now they're immediately getting highlighted before they even drop down. So we have to exclude the quad from that function too. let's go ahead and do that right now. So in check all blocks for matches, we want to make sure that these are not part of the quad. So luckily we have the helper function for that. I'm doing it after this initial check just to make sure I don't, pass in a non-valid block to this function. But that necessitates a second branch here, but that's fine. Or rather, if this is not part of the quad, so if this returns false, then we run this. I'm gonna just, you don't have to do this, but I'm gonna put here a not boolean just to invert the output of this function, and then that way I can use the true branch here. If the current block is not part of the quad, then determine matches. That way we won't be highlighting our quad if our quad happens to be off the bat, all four. Okay, if you saw that, the blocks didn't all become matched at the same time. There's sort of a delay between them. That could be because the logic is really inefficient, so it's like taking multiple cycles to do that, in which case we'll run into frame rate problems probably. But maybe it's just maybe it's fine. We'll see. Okay, now we have a little issue if well, this probably would be solved by having a proper game over check. So if I placed a block such that, this happened, then that would be a game over. So we'd be able to cover that when we add a game over state. I am a little bit confused as to why the highlighting is suddenly so slow like that. See how it takes like multiple cycles for the blocks to all become highlighted and stuff at the same time. And when I say highlighted, I mean matched. When they're becoming matched, they all happen at different times. Yeah, see, there should have been some highlights there that didn't take place because the highlighting is so delayed right now for some reason. Okay, after a bit of sleuthing through the code, I think I may have worked out why this delay seems to be happening, where we'll make a match like this and it seems to be like there's a delayed reaction between when the match should occur and when it does occur. Sometimes it doesn't even work at all. I think part of what's causing this is some of the new changes I made weren't well thought out, and I'll show you why in a second. So like that weird delayed reaction, I think that's happening because first let's step through what's happening when I have this quad that I'm controlling and I do a quick drop to the bottom like that. Let's go through the blueprints and find out why this might be happening. So player controller runs, and when you press drop, it drops automatically down one space rapidly, so then it's going to rapidly automatically fall, and then when it reaches the bottom it'll call finish falling, and then when finish falling calls, it calls check for matches on all blocks. But we haven't spawned a new quad in yet, so our 4 quad references still reference the blocks that are in their final positions. But when we call check for matches, we exclude the quad from those checks. So we don't update their matched status, which we do within this function, we don't update that right away when we should update it. So we can try to fix that by not calling this function until we've spawned in a new quad, so we can call this function first and then call check for matches on all blocks. That may fix somewhat the problem here. So I'm going to put this last in the order, and we'll see how that affects things, if at all. And hopefully this will fix that sort of weird delayed cascade of matches. But if not, then there's maybe a performance issue somewhere else in the blueprints. Okay, so far that looks much better. The highlights are all, or the matched highlights are all happening like at the same time. And so far it's not ignoring ones that should be matches. And it's now behaving more similar to the real game, where as soon as it reaches a non-highlighted row, it's going to clear all the highlights up until that point. And when they drop, let's verify that they do form new matches when they should, like these orange ones should form a new match there. Alright, so this is looking very good. This is looking how we want it to be. I'm going to go ahead and move on to adding a few more things to make this more like the real game, like the scoring and a UI, and particularly the UI, we should add so in the real game there's a preview list of the upcoming blocks, so you have like, here's the next one in the order, and then here's the one after that, and here's the one after that. So you have the block you're currently controlling at the top, and then the next 3 quads that you will be getting next, like in the queue, are going to show up here. So I think that'll be fun to add them in and animate them so that they slide from one slot to the next before they get to here. And then from here, we could have it slide over to here, but we don't want to impact the gameplay at all. We want that to be entirely like a cosmetic thing you can use if you want to for more strategy, but we don't want it to be too distracting. So I have an idea for bringing those into the game in a cool way that'll add a bit of visual flair. So we'll go ahead and work on that now, and then we'll add the scoring UI, and the timer bar in the real game has a number here showing you how many matches you've made in this current cycle through for the purposes of adding up combos. So we'll get all that in there too, so it's like a full-fledged Lumines replica, and that's going to be really fun.